So George Hook is with me today. We are live. It's 8 o'clock in Ireland. And George, I'm in Florida. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, because it's current, what do you make of what's going on in America at the moment?
Well, one the first thing I say is if the Americans every day in their newspapers criticize the Irish political system and the Irish leaders, we would be appalled. Yet we have absolutely no problem criticizing the former US president or any other US president and telling them how dreadful they are and what an awful people they are. We have no right to do that. Donald Trump was elected by the Irish people.
The American people.
Sorry, by the
Yeah.
American people. Then we suddenly say, yeah, but Hillary won the popular vote. What's the popular vote got to do with it? The system is the Electoral College, not their system. We can't criticize them for their system. So I think we have an awful cheek. The second thing is that our entire media sort of lives in Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., with the odd visit to San Francisco and Los Angeles. And then this entire country in between, they ignore. They've never been there. They've never talked to anybody there. I remember I criticized the Irish Times journalist, Una Mullally, ferociously for not, talking to others Americans. She said, of course I did. And then she listed about 6 states she had visited, all on the eastern seaboard.
Yes.
If you haven't been to Green Bay, Wisconsin, if you haven't been to Lawrence, Kansas, if you haven't been to Dubuque, Iowa, if you haven't been to Birmingham, Alabama, if you haven't been to Baton Rouge, then
Louisiana, yeah.
you know nothing about America. I have.
Yes.
And there are only 2 states in the entire America that I haven't visited, North and South Dakota.
Wow.
Been to Hawaii and I've been to Alaska and I've been to all the others to boot. So therefore, because nobody ever accused me of being modest, I will say that I know as much about America as any Irish journalist before or since.
Wow. So what had you in America, and what kind of things were you doing that, apart from coaching rugby, but what was your connection to the land and that extensive travels that you obviously did?
Well, the first thing is I'm a passionate believer in career guidance for school children because I didn't get any career guidance,
Okay.
although my father did tell me I should become, and my mother told me I should become an accountant. The last thing I should have been was an accountant, so I failed at accountancy. Then I tried to set up my own business. I was brilliantly successful at selling stuff, but I couldn't keep money. Money had an inability to slip through my fingers. So for 25 or 30 years, I lost money running a business, which I kept alive by borrowing, by robbing Peter to pay Paul, and
Okay.
so on. And that drove me to going to the end of Dunleary Pier one dark night and taking my clothes off and preparing to dive in. I still don't know why I didn't, but I got to that point. So then here I am in sort of 1991 or so, and I had coached the Americans in the '87 World Cup in Australia because I had made a connection with the American coach at that time through video. I mean, 1987 video is pretty simple, but anyway. But he then rang me in about 91 and he said, look, we're looking for a head guy to run American coaching and rugby generally. Do you know anybody? And I said, absolutely me. And he said, that'd be great. And he said, there's only one problem. We have no money. So I said, well, I'm used to working without any money. But I said, what I'll do is I'll get a sponsor to pay for me. And I had a rough idea who the sponsor was. I duly got him. He sponsored me. And then for 5 years, I ran American rugby from a technical point of view, not from an administrative point of view. I was national technical director. So for 5 years, every single weekend, I was in a different city. So like I defy somebody, to give me a city in America and I've been in it.
Wow.
Okay. So because I was running coaching courses. So I got to know America extraordinarily well. But a country I love, a country I've always loved since somebody first explained Omaha Beach to me. From the moment somebody explained young GIs dying on a beach in Normandy, I was an American lover.
So, how did lovely Ingrid handle all of this moving around and all the setbacks and all the failures and all that? It must have been a strain, or what? How did that all work?
You've asked that question very politely, whereas in fact you are looking at um, the holder of the world's worst husband of the year award for 20 consecutive years. So let me tell you about this husband, all right? This guy marries this beautiful German girl, although I met her in Britain. I bring her back to Ireland. She doesn't know anybody, nobody except a few people who were at our wedding. And I bring her home. And then she suddenly discovers this guy, first of all, is a rugby lunatic and he's missing most of the time. He's then got a business, so he can't pay the bills. And she works. And she was a pharmacist. And she eventually finished up in Trinity and so on as a lecturer. So she's suddenly paying the bills. And there's guys knocking at the door saying, your husband owes me money. And she did that. And then I don't know how she did it, see, because I wasn't there. So how did she go to the supermarket on Thursday, buy all the food, and then at Easter time, get the stuff for the Easter bunny for the kids? How did she do it? I had no idea. I wasn't there, right? I was missing, right? So that's the first thing. That's the first sort of 20 years of our marriage, right? But at least I was in Ireland. Now in 1991, I disappeared to America. I abandoned my wife and children. Now, she had every reason, to ring up her lawyer. I don't think she expected me back, to be honest, right? Now, the deal I had with the Americans was I spent roughly 6 months in America and 6 months in Ireland. So, because obviously summertime in America, there wasn't rugby going on and so on. So I wasn't exactly gone, right? But I was missing, right? She didn't know whether I had another, I was a bigamist in America. She didn't know what the hell. And she was still paying all the bills. She was still surviving. For some extraordinary reason, she held this marriage together. Some unbelievable reason. And as you and I speak, we are approaching over 50 years of marriage, 52 years of marriage.
Congratulations, George.
Right? All her credit.
Wow.
Extraordinary, this woman. Now, all countries and all nations and all peoples have national characteristics. I think it's fair that, it might be unfair to my fellow Irish men, but Irish men are a bit sort of, irresponsible periodically. Whereas Germans are correct, dedicated,
conscientious,
work ethic, all the sort of good things. So she demonstrated all that in spades.
Wow.
But the extraordinary thing, and this is really extraordinary, I have an amazing relationship with my children. Mm-hmm. Now, you would think this guy is a complete waster. He can't pay his bills. He does all this thing. But for some reason, and I actually don't know how I did it, I had a great relationship with my children. I remember my youngest girl, Alison, who's a banker in London now. Alison said, well, Pop, she said, when we'd have a school play or something, Mum would be in the front row 20 minutes before the start with Granny, and they'd be sitting there ready to go. And then with about 60 seconds to curtain up, you would arrive, hurtle through the door, and we knew you'd taken one plane, 2 trains, 3 taxis to get there.
Yes.
And we appreciated that. So she said, really, Pop, the situation was, most of the time we went to Mom and said, what do we do? But if the manure hit the fan, we went to you. So
Wow.
somehow I got that relationship, and here I am today with 3 children, with 9 grandchildren. I have all that, and I just think I'm the luckiest guy in the world, and it's luck. I mean, there's no plan here. I didn't do anything. I mean, when I finally got a real job in 1995, age 54, my first real job, the first time I actually got a paycheck on a Friday, okay? I was looking at probably living in a caravan somewhere, divorced, probably a wino, I mean, that's what I was looking at. And then and I have to say I had talent. I mean, I'm not going to, I'm not modest.
I know what you mean, though. You're frank. Yeah.
I suddenly discovered what I was good at. I was good at talking. Well, everyone knew I was good at talking. So now I'm on television, I'm on radio, and I start making money, unbelievably. I'm in credit with the Bank of Ireland, right? Now, lucky for me, the Bank of Ireland computers don't go back far enough, and they don't realize I'm an absolute ne'er-do-well, okay? So they're sending me platinum credit cards and all sorts of stuff, but I actually have money, and I have a pension. So here I am, 79 years of age, and I have a pension. And I'm living at home with this wonderful woman. I never believed it possible. And it happened. And this is really where young people have to, or anybody of any age, like, I didn't learn until I was 54. So it's not the end of the world when you're 24, 34, or 44. The important thing is to be doing what you want to do.
When you said you didn't learn until 54, what do you mean?
Well, I didn't learn what I was good at.
Yes, yeah.
I didn't, I never thought of writing a letter to RT and saying, hello, can I have an interview? I just never thought of that. I could never imagine that I'd be able to do that. Like, my self-esteem, it's really interesting. Like, if you're failing all the time, if you can't pay bills, if you can't be a husband, your self-esteem is destroyed, and you just think you're useless. And then suddenly I get this job, right? And guess how much they're paying me? Guess how much they're paying me? £25 a go, right? Or to our American friends, $30. So I'm on television doing rugby for $30, right?
Yeah.
But, and here's the crucial thing. Ingrid saw a check for $30 coming in the post. For the first time ever, she had a husband who was earning money. $30, but it was earning as opposed to losing. Okay?
I get you.
And then the Irish Independent rang me. I'd done a couple of television shows. And the guy in the Irish, it was really interesting. Ingrid rings me. Now, I'm a preparer, right? So I'm normally in RTE when in those days, like 3 hours before kickoff, So she rings me and she says, there's some guy looking for you urgently, but I can't pronounce his name, right? So then she gives me a number. So I ring up and this guy answers, I know no Sulawan, right? Bit of a mouthful for a German, So I said, how are you? George here. Oh, he said, brilliant. He said, I watched it on television last week. I know you're on television today. Would you do a piece for us tomorrow for the Sunday? I said, sure, yeah. He said, well, look, as soon as the match is over, I'll get a guy to ring you and you talk to him and then he'll write it. Oh, no, I said, I'll write it. And I always remember he said to me, because we became great friends, he said, can you do that? And I always remember I said, I went to school, didn't I? Right?
Yes.
So he said 500 words. So when it was over, I went to a desk and I got a pen and I got paper and I wrote 500 words and I counted them. And this is the old days, like this is
before Microsoft Word kind of thing, was it?
Oh yeah, this is pre-Microsoft Word. This is 1995. And then I call it down the line because somebody at the other end in the Indo with a typewriter is taking it. And I call it down the line. And I had an extraordinary relationship with the Independent. In all the time I wrote for them, over 20 years, I never had a contract. And I know Sullivan, who was the sports editor, in the first week of the year, he would meet me in a coffee shop in Blackrock, and we'd have a coffee. And then he would take a bit of paper out of his pocket, a grubby piece of paper, and he would hand it to me, right? And he would say, "That's what I'm going to pay you per article this year." And I'd look at that, and it would be a number, and I'd say, "Fine."
I'll take that.
Was a relationship. You'll be delighted to hear, sir, that after 20 years, they were paying me more than 25 quid a go.
Well, I think it was worth it. I think you've contributed quite a lot. But look, you have said that you're no longer a proud member of the Fourth Estate. I saw you make a very compelling case on a show called The Irish Inquiry, or The Irish Inquirer. Yeah. And I just found that kind of little phrase interesting. So do you mind me asking you about that? And how do you feel that now that you're outside of this kind of world of the Irish mainstream, is that something that you embraced with, let's say, excitement and freedom or something like that? Or was this, do you feel like you're kind of left out? Or do you know, how do you feel about all that?
Well, I think it's very important. Here am I on YouTube with you, and then in the next breath, I'm saying I'm not interested in making a comeback, you know? I mean, I'm not interested in making a comeback. I'm doing this for you, and I've done stuff for other people because I like the people who ring me up and say, "Will you do it?" You're not even paying me £25 a go, which is quite right.
If I could, George, I'd pay a lot more than that, but yeah.
Which is quite disappointing. So, what has happened in Irish media is really very interesting, in that everybody now who holds a sort of contrary view to the mainstream is fired. So you can go back, you can go to Kevin Myers on the Sunday Times, me. Now, was I right to be fired? I don't know. I don't care really, because I clumsily said something that I actually had. So many people thought what I had to say was valid, but I said it badly. So was that a mistake? Yes. Should you be punished for your mistake if you live by the sword? Should you die by the sword? Yes. Right. But I remember talking to Kevin Myers, because he was sacked before me, and I remember saying to him, like, "How did you feel?" And he said, "Well, I had about 15 cases for libel." And I said, "Well, why didn't you pursue them, you know?" Mm-hmm. And he said, "Well, you know, I would have just kept the whole thing going, and I didn't want to." And then when it happened to me, I had 15 cases for libel, yes, and I didn't pursue them. It was extraordinary. Like, a member of the Irish Parliament went on the Sean O'Rourke show, and she said, this was at the height of the furore, she said, "Hook has form," she hissed. "He plies women with drink and has his way with them." Right?
Now, a member of Parliament, a TD.
TD.
Good grief.
Just let me segue slightly.
No,
At the 2020 general election, as is my wont, I am watching the results. And lo and behold, the female TD does not get elected. I cracked a bottle of champagne. But here's the interesting thing. I wrote a book, and I humorously in the book talked about being in England as an Irish Catholic virgin, right? And I met this woman in Northampton who wore eyeshadow, and Brother Athanasius in Presentation College had warned me about girls who wore eyeshadow.
What did he say about them, George?
Yeah.
What was the warning?
Oh, dodgy. But also, like women who drank gin and tonic, right?
Yes. So
she also drinks gin and tonic. I don't even drink, right? So now she's passed two incredible hurdles for this virgin, right? She drinks and she has eyeshadow. So I'm made up here. I mean, this is my big chance. And then she says, "Do you want to come back to my apartment?" And this is in my book. So I go back to her apartment. And then the punchline in the book is, I arrived in her apartment as an Irish Catholic virgin And I left her apartment as an Irish Catholic virgin,
Yes.
right? Okay. But the good old Irish TD had used that
Wow.
on radio to say, that he did. And then, so there was this pandemonium. So anyway, I essentially get sacked, right? Although, to be fair to News Talk and the board and everything, they were essentially supportive, but in the face of advertisers saying, we're not going to advertise, because it was just it was a witch hunt. So I wanted to go on then. I wanted to do, podcasts and webcasts. And I wanted to show the world, that Hook was here.
Yes. Yes.
And then I'm invited to 3 lunches. Daughter number 1, son number 1, daughter number 2. And they all say the same thing. If you go back in the limelight, we'll never speak to you again, right? Now, why did they do that, you may ask, okay? Well, the weekend after the thing had blown up, we were besieged in our house. Besieged. There were probably 30, 40 journalists outside our front door, cameramen. They knocked on, because I was watching telly, they knocked on my window, they knocked on my door, they pushed messages through my letterbox, they sent me text messages, and besieged us. And my daughter was in the house, and she was unbelievably upset. Ingrid takes these things better than I do, but nevertheless, they were deeply upset. Letters started to arrive in the following weeks and months. Anonymous letters started to arrive, not to me, but to my wife and my children.
Which is worse, isn't it?
Oh, of course, because I don't give an SH1T, I'm fine with this. I can take this, but they can't, and they shouldn't take it. I mean, Ingrid, receives a letter which says, it's a shame his mother didn't abort him, that he was around to marry you. She received a mail with a used condom in it. My children received stuff. So you can understand why they took me out to lunch, They don't need that or want that. So I'm quite conscious about doing stuff,
I get you. Yes.
And I'm doing this for you because I trust you.
And putting the head above the parapet kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm good with it. But now the interesting thing is I am utterly relaxed about it. I'm fine with it. I'm done. I'm in a place where I never thought I would be. I am so happy at home, married to this amazing woman, great kids, great grandchildren. I have a pension, which I never thought I would have. So I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine.
On a day-to-day basis, what has George Hook been doing since those fateful days in the end of 2017, I believe, that all happened?
Yeah.
So, and you're clearly, and I don't mean to say this in any kind of patronizing way, you are very, very sharp for a man of 79. I think you'll accept me saying that. Yeah. So, and I also read that you had, in an article about you, that you were worried about dementia, and this was when you were 72. So 7 years later, you haven't fallen foul of these kind of things. Do you know? So how do you keep yourself in check in that kind of way?
Well, there are 2 things, really. And you've got to think about pre-COVID, and COVID. And COVID is essentially St. Patrick's Day, March the 17th, to the uninitiated, when this whole thing broke up and we were shut down. And they actually told us, and then later they said they only advised us, but they actually told us, if you're over 70, you don't step outside your front door. So we didn't step outside our front door for 3 months. Okay. The wonderful local guy, newsagent, stroke, grocery, used to deliver the stuff to our doorstep and so on. And I have survived COVID. The odd bits when I've been out and got the odd golf, but a lot of it I've been in the house. To an interesting combination, which I don't recommend now. I'm not recommending this to survive COVID, but it is my methodology, all right, which is 14 hours of Netflix, 3 large gin and tonics, and half to 3/4 of a bottle of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And I find that COVID holds no fears.
So that's how you keep yourself going, I suppose.
But there is an interesting point, if you don't mind me saying.
Go, yeah.
Now, I've already told you about this marriage of mine when I'm missing and bills and everything else. I have not missed dinner at home for obvious reasons since March the 17th. So what? I've had about 300 dinners at home. Mm-hmm. So I know there are major mental problems caused by COVID. There are domestic abuse issues caused by COVID. But for me, I've discovered marriage at 79. Wow. Ingrid and I are actually great company. You know what I mean?
No, like, it's, yes.
Right, because we're together every single day. Now, it's a shame I didn't discover that 52 years ago.
I know what you mean.
But better late than never.
But again, it's, George, it's a recurring, you could say it's a recurring instance of the phenomenon where you came late to the game with the whole broadcasting thing. You realised the merits or whatever, the joys of marriage maybe later than you would like to have done. And I want to bring up something a bit different, but maybe continuing a similar theme. And it is that I think I was in 5th or 6th year, but I used to find any excuse not to study and do my homework. And there was a talk in Glasgow Catholic Church given by Michael McGeaney, I think, the son-in-law of Mickey Hart. And there was this series that they were doing. And you were part of the same series, and I didn't hear you talk. But what I want to ask you about is your journey in and out of Catholicism. You kind of joked about being a Catholic virgin in London, and then I had read that you kind of didn't take all that stuff too seriously, and then in later years have you returned to that faith that you were brought up with, or how has that, what's the role of that in your life, and what role do you play, do you think, in that kind of mechanism?
You speak about the Glasgow thing. It was an evening at the Abbey, it was called, because the church was opposite Presentation College Glasgow. And I'm a Presentation College Cork boy. Yes. So Brother Andrew rang me up and said, well, to speak at it, okay? Yes. And essentially I talked about, in a way I've never been away, from Catholicism. But I was born in 1941, so it's very hard for people to understand that in 1940, in the 40s and 50s, Ireland was 99% white, Catholic, and church-going. Okay, and the only black people we ever saw was when the African missions down in Black Rock had the odd fella come over to visit from Africa, and we thought they were Americans, and we used to go up to them and say, have you had any chewing gum? But anyway, to cut to the chase, so that was pretty basic stuff, right? Religion was pretty basic. Confession on Saturday night, church on Sunday morning, and communion. You could only, to receive, you had to go to Mass before 10, right? John Paul XXII was a long way away. There was no Saturday night Mass, okay? And obviously, really, as kids, we only had one sin to confess, and that was what we did when we were by ourselves at home in bed, right? And the big problem is when I went to see, we'd go to confession, and the nearest church to me was the Capuchin church, and I'd go to the Capuchins, and any man would start shouting at me, and I'm in the box, right? Not just me shouting at all us young people.
I know, yeah.
You're going to produce deformed children, you're going, your parts of you are going to drop off, and blah, 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 right? This terrifying stuff, right? So, and then you'd walk out, and all the old dears would be sitting outside, and they'd heard all this, right? So anyway, there's a wonderful church in Cork called St. Mary's Pope's Quay. It's a Dominican church. And I'm not sure why I was down that neck of the woods one particular Saturday night, but I was. And I go in, and there's a box, and it's Father Alphonsus Moran, O.P., Order of Preachers, Dominican. So I go in, how are you, Father? 179 times last week, And he said, that's quite all right.
Wow.
That's part of growing up. That's what happens to young men. Now, I think we could cut down on 179, but don't worry about it. 3 Hail Marys, okay? So now I'm back in prayers on Monday at school. Lads, there's a fella in St. Mary's Pope's Quay who's okay with what we do. So forever after, there's queues outside Father Moran's box of teenage boys all confessing the same sin, right? Now, we laugh at that. Right?
Yes.
But a good friend of mine, his wife presented him with a baby who was damaged at birth. He needed psychiatric help. He was utterly convinced that what he had done as a school kid on his own had been the cause of the damage to his child. So although it's funny, we were brought up in pretty strict stuff. Then I went to London because I couldn't afford to go to university. So I worked to get money to go to university. And I went to university at 21 when mature students were pretty rare. And I'd be going to mass every Sunday in London, And then I was working for an insurance company in Trafalgar Square. And I remember it's Ash Wednesday. And I come in with ash on my forehead to work. And all these good English people are saying, George, do you realize there's dirt on your forehead, right? So you believed, and you believed if you didn't go to mass, all hell was going to break loose or whatever. You were still a virgin, so sex was still an unbelievable mystery to you. So that was the first phase, if you like, of Catholicism.
And do you mind me just asking? I know obviously these are personal things, and you're being very open, and I very much appreciate that. But would you have resisted that restriction, let's say, that you felt you had to abide by when you were 20 and 19, or were you saying, okay, this is the way it is, and I'm okay with that?
Well, brainwashing has a pretty negative reputation now. But we were essentially brainwashed. But we were brainwashed by the Presentation Brothers, who I have enormous regard for. I wouldn't be talking to you without the education the Presentation Brothers gave me. But Catholicism was a very, very strict business, and it was a very simple business. Here are 10 commandments, you abide by them. You go to Mass on Sunday. If you don't go to Mass on Sunday, it's a monster sin, right? If you do different things with girls, they're monster sins as well, and so on. Now, funny enough, they never kind of told us if you murder somebody, it's bad news, or if you rob a bank. They were much more interested in what we might be doing with girls. But anyway, then you kind of fall away because in my case, there's the enormous pressure of work. I married a non-Catholic. Then you're trying to bring up kids, you're doing all this stuff, and suddenly you're drifting away. In my case, in my head, I never went away. What I went away from was going to Mass and going to confession and all that sort of stuff. But for my entire life, I've ended a discussion with somebody by saying, God bless, or I've prayed for people, and then there's another thing, which is very important. I adored my parents. I adored them. Only child, my parents, poor, left school at 14. Somehow they managed to send me to a fee-paying school. I was pretty well the only person in the area who did the Leaving Cert. If I wasn't the only fellow who did Leaving Cert, I was certainly the only fellow who went to a fee-paying school, right? And I treated them appallingly in latter life, because I was too busy. My life was falling apart, and instead of looking after my parents, I was worrying about myself. So, and my mother never saw me successful. She adored me, and she overlooked all my weaknesses. I want to go to heaven and say, Ma, I made it, Now, I know that comes from a Jimmy Cagney movie, but it is actually true. I want to meet her in heaven and say, Ma'am, I delivered for you. I really did it. And then my father, my father never read a book of fiction in his life. This is a fellow who left school at 14. And he would take me to the Cork City Library. Like, my parents were educated by the Cork City Library. And he would take me to the Cork City Library. And I'd turn left for the children's department. And he'd turn right for the adult department. And then we'd meet in 40 minutes when we had our book. Mm. And then I have this memory of the kitchen. Like, remember, this is a 2 up, 2 down, terraced house, no running water, outside toilet, right? Running water is a tap in the yard, okay? So I have this memory of sitting in the kitchen. There wouldn't be a sound, right? 3 people reading books, okay? Wow. And I grew up with that. And then the other thing, which really saved my bacon, was we listened to the radio. You see, most people now, their understanding of broadcasting is television. And they think radio is just television without a picture. Radio is a totally different medium. And I got to remember, I grew up with that. I grew up with the BBC. I grew up with the great BBC comedy. I was doing my homework, though. The Goon Show, Hancock's Half Hour, Raise a Laugh. I'd be doing that. So I learned all that. Listening to Terry Wogan in the morning, the way he presented that musical stuff, and everything. So I learned. There was a fellow called Jimmy Young who came on after Wogan. Right, and Jimmy Young, interestingly, was a singer in his original life, and he had 2 number 1s in the British hit parade. And then he became a broadcaster. He was unbelievably successful, and I copied Jimmy Young. Mm-hmm. I remember saying when I started, everything I do here, I've stolen from somebody.
Yes,
and it was true. I stole it from somebody, and I always remember Jimmy Young. Used to have this fella, and he used to come in the morning and he'd say, "Morning, Tone, how are you?" And your man would say, "Morning, Jim." And he used to talk about vegetables, right? So we talked about vegetables for 10 minutes, and your man would sort of say, well, there's mushrooms at the moment in Tesco's are really good value at 2 and 6pence a punnet or whatever it was. And I thought, the idea of having somebody that you talk to is a really good idea. So I brought in a film guy, and I brought in a travel guy, but it was all stuff that I got from. I didn't see a television picture really until I was 21.
Okay.
So radio was my gig, really.
Yes, and you were learning things that you applied at 55, but that you didn't realize you'd be using until you were at that age, So I'm curious, what kind of things, is there one standout thing that life taught you up to your broadcasting, before your broadcasting, that other people who are, let's say, a lifelong broadcaster or journalist or whatever, that they might have missed out on, or something like that?
Well, when Terry Wogan retired from the radio, he thanked the one person who listened to him. Right. And I'd heard this before. And so when I started broadcasting to one, and until I ended, I was only speaking to one person. I didn't know the gender of this person, but I had a rough idea, because I was in drive time. I had a rough idea they were in a motor car and they were heading home. There's a big difference between going to work in the morning because you've been asleep, so you don't know what's going on. So now you want somebody to tell you, this is what's happened while you were asleep. At drive time, you're heading home, you're relaxed, work is over. You now want somebody to sort of take you home. And I always had this idea that I was taking this person home, And that was the thing I learned. And also, all the old music hall comedians. Well, let me explain music hall. Music hall was like variety in theaters before there was television or radio and all this sort of thing. And these comedians would, because they were going around the country all the time, they never changed their act. They were telling the same jokes, but they were in Glasgow this week and Manchester next week or whatever, so nobody had heard jokes before. But the staple joke was the mother-in-law joke. And the mother-in-law joke also maybe referred to her indoors. So a lot of comedians would talk about her indoors, the wife, a fellow called Les Dawson, who was a great comedian. He always used to talk about his wife. Nobody ever saw his wife or anything. So I didn't invent the lovely Ingrid, but every program I would talk about the lovely Ingrid. Now, I swear to God, I adored her and was like at her side every night of the week, which is far from the truth. But I stole that. I stole that from musical comedians, the idea of this woman, nobody, and to this very day, well, not so much day now, but when we'd go out, we'd be in a restaurant, somebody would come over and say, oh, this must be the lovely Ingrid.
Yes.
So
no, that's lovely.
It's this word osmosis, which probably most people know. I learned radio by osmosis.
Yes.
I learned all this stuff from them. All those great broadcasters,
So you have, again, I know you're kind of, you don't want to bring unnecessary attention to your family and yourself, and you don't want to,
I'm okay.
Whatever, but still, you're not coming out necessarily all guns blazing, but it would be ignoring the elephant in the room if I was not to ask you about your recent contributions to public discussion on the virus. And although you have made peace with what you do every day, you're kind of aware of, let's say, the unintended consequences of what is happening. So can you talk to me a bit about what you see is happening in Ireland right now, and obviously across much of the world, but Ireland would be where you're most familiar with.
Of course. Funny enough, I've already said, I don't want to go back on radio or anything, and I don't want to, but I was talking to one of my golfing buddies recently before the golf shut down, and I said to him, I've never wanted to be on the radio as much as I do now, right? Because there is no discourse. There is no discourse. Nobody is prepared. Anybody who does ask the difficult question just gets chopped off at the knees. And what we have at the moment, I have two very interesting heroes who probably wouldn't talk to each other if I invited them to dinner. One would be Michael Collins and the other would be Winston Churchill. But Winston Churchill famously said, there's all these different ways of governing a country. Democracy isn't great, but it's the best we've got, or words to that effect. So we're a democracy, barely 100 years old, not even 100 years old. And we're a democracy, and we elect people. And there's a thing called the franchise where you go in and you put a pencil in a space and all that. And that's extraordinary. It's an incredible thing.
You mean the voting, the way it works?
Yes.
Yes. And the counting is what I'm intrigued by, the way the counting is beautiful.
They have a democracy. And if we went to Belarus or other countries and we said, listen, we have a democracy, we can vote for who we like, they'd be looking at us and thinking, you can't be serious, right? We're looking what's happening in Poland and Hungary, literally as we speak, changes in democracy, okay? So we are now governed, in my view, by an unelected civil servant, the chief medical officer, Dr. Houlihan, because he makes pronouncements, and the government, until just literally very recently, for the first time, the government actually said, well, no, we're going to do something different. But he has run the country, and he has run the country, in my view, into the ground.
With the support, it must be granted, in fairness to who, look, whatever about the merits of what he's saying, he hasn't.
About my opinion.
I know. But just to say, he's kind of egged on, it seems, by the discussion or lack thereof in Ireland. Do you know? Which is another feature. But anyway, go on. Sorry to cut across you.
But no, I think he's now a celeb. Now usually celebs were like Ryan Tubridy or God forgive him, poor old Terry Wogan or whatever. That's what celebs were,
yes,
or film stars or whatever. He's now a celeb, right? Yes. He's on the telly every day, okay? And a year ago, there were all these guys in dusty laboratories, right, lecturing a few students. Nobody heard of them, right? They are now all celebs. You cannot have a radio or television program without the professor of epidemiology or immunology or something else. You can't have it, but it's not possible to have a program. So this guy comes on, this professor comes on. Nobody heard of him until 9 months ago. He's now this guy. He probably got a book to be published. He's on the telly every week. We hang on his every word, and he says this is the position, and everybody says certainly whatever you say.
Sir.
Yes sir, no sir. So last March, guy comes out. Hello, I'm professor of you-know-what. Do you realise 80,000 people are going to die in Ireland? Do you realise that our hospitals are going to be overrun? Our ICUs are going to be packed with dying people. He didn't quite say, but he almost did. You know, there'll be people on the pavement dying in front of our very eyes. Did it happen? Oh, it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Did it happen because Tony Holohan, the savior of the modern world, came along and locked us all up and said, for the first time since the penal laws, you can't go to church. Mm-hmm. You can't visit your children. Your family are actually dangerous. Your family are your enemy. Your family aren't your friend. They're dangerous because they might infect you. Is that the reason?
And it's worse because you might infect them. So it's not only I'm risking myself, but there's this whole thing. Oh well, I could be killing my granny. Do you know what I mean? It's not only that you take. Do you know? So that's how they get you, I suppose, or that's where the fear.
My children have said that to me. Particularly in the early part, and increasingly people, I think, are beginning to question. Although in the latest opinion poll, Tony Holohan is currently outpolling St. Francis of Assisi. Yes. But like the thing is that if you look at all the numbers, if at one point there was 1,000 people a day been infected. So after 7 days, that's 7,000. So you'd expect there'd be a ton of people in hospital, but there wasn't a ton of people in hospital. There wasn't a ton of people in ICU. Probably as we speak, 300 or 400 people in hospital, 30 or 40 people in ICU, probably. Where's the overrun? Like if you think that we did an unbelievably expensive deal with all the private hospitals. And we said to the private hospital, you know, the people aren't entitled to go to you because they haven't got insurance and everything else. Well, like you'll have to take them now to bail us out. Then they went out to City West, where there's this huge place, and they said, listen, we're going to turn this into a hospital. Neither of those places have had a patient. So, like, if somebody is wrong, if you were an economist or you were a political analyst or, God forbid, you were a rugby pundit, you know, and you said, Ireland are going to beat the All Blacks by 50 points next Saturday, and then they didn't, you know, there'd be questions in Parliament. But these so-called experts can turn around and say, this is going to happen. It hasn't happened. But what they are not telling us, and this is why it is wrong, what they are not telling us is the damage. We know 300,000 cancer checks have not happened this year. So therefore we know that there's going to be people die of cancer who might not have died of cancer. We know that. We know that people have died by suicide who might not have died by suicide. We know that families have been abused who might not otherwise have been abused but for this. And above all, we know that the economy is finished. Maybe not to recover. We can fix it. No, we can fix it. There's absolute no doubt we can fix it. If we all stay at home, none of us go to work, and we live by gaslight, and we don't have any electricity, and we don't have any cookers and everything, and we live by gaslight, and we keep pigs in the back garden and chickens, and we probably will be at zero COVID that these guys are so fond of saying.
Yes.
But you cannot live without an economy. You mightn't like capitalism, but it's the way we survive.
And George, how do you think this is going to be compared to, say, 2008 or other economic downturns you want to witness, say, in the 1980s and things like that? Is there any, have we had the time yet to establish the magnitude of this?
Well,
or are we just going to be guessing? Are we going to be making these projections? Do you know, a little bit like maybe the virus projections, which
the whole thing
weren't accurate?
Correct. It's all guesswork. But we do know this, though. I'm glad you mentioned 08, right? Or any previous time. Okay, if you go back all the way to the 1928 Depression, okay? Never in the history of the world have governments borrowed so much money. Now, the theory is this money is cheap, so we can borrow it, okay? But my mother and everybody else's mother knows that if you borrow money, you have to pay it back, okay? Might be a lot of interest, but you have to pay it back. So we're going to have to pay it back. How do you pay it back? How does a country pay it back? They pay it back by taxes. So therefore, as night follows day, taxes must increase. I'm no economist. I'm no accountant.
It's basics though, yeah.
But I can do arithmetic.
Yes.
So when Sinn Féin say, and Sinn Féin are going to be the next government, the next Taoiseach is going to be Mary Lou McDonald. When Sinn Féin are in power, they're going to say, hey folks, free money for everybody. Come to the Sinn Féin office in Parnell Square on Friday and we'll give you free money. And then they're going to discover, we don't have any money. And they're going to have to raise taxes. They'll get elected because everybody thinks that Mary Lou and Santa Claus are in the same family. They're not. So borrowing all the borrowing has done, and nobody knows better than me. I stayed in business for 25 years by borrowing, right?
Yes.
Borrowing disguises the problem. It doesn't fix it.
So I suppose we'll see how that all turns out. You mentioned Churchill, and you're clearly a big admirer of him. And I'm wondering, because it seems, okay, let me just first state this. In Irish politics right now, there doesn't seem to be a hero who is taking on the cause of the resistance, let's say, to what's being done. That voice isn't there. It also doesn't seem to be there in RTE or News Talk or Virgin Media or the Irish Times, etc. And so I'm wondering, and maybe this is a waste of time because this is the past, but is there any Irish figure that you think could have been able to do this, who had the conviction of someone like Churchill, or the whatever virtues you saw in someone like him, or whatever? Do you know who could do this? Or is it that if George hadn't fallen foul of all that stuff a few years ago, would you have been? Do you think you could have made a big difference here on the airwaves?
No, first of all, it's a massive exaggeration to think that George could make a difference. All right, but if you look at what happened to people who, like John Waters or Kevin Myers, or even Sean O'Rourke, who went to a golf match, right? The mob, right? The mob. And the mob now sits comfortably on Twitter. So it is just waiting. The mob are now currently knitting. The guillotine has been sharpened, and they're waiting for the next person to come up in the tumbril so they can watch his head fall in the basket, right? Now, you're a broadcaster, say, and you're working for whoever you're working for. Are you going to risk having your head chopped off by the mob? You're not. You're just not. Why would you? So therefore, nobody is prepared to challenge the accepted view. Who could was your question. It's not a broadcaster. Churchill wasn't a media figure, although he was. I mean, in terms of the amount of stuff he wrote, he was a media figure. He earned his livelihood writing. London is burning. Night after night, German bombers are coming in and bombing the city. Cities in flames. The whole population is living like rats in the underground tube stations, coming up the following morning to see what damage has been done. And there's this voice. Every night or every couple of nights, as this voice comes on the radio. I can offer you nothing but blood, sweat, toil, and tears. And then after that extraordinary summer and autumn, when eventually the German bombers couldn't do it anymore, he said, never in the history of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few, right? And then he said, when they wanted to surrender, when Chamberlain and his foreign minister wanted to surrender, and there was 400,000 people sitting on the beaches in Dunkirk, maybe never to come home, he said, we will fight them in the beaches. We will fight them on the roads. We will fight them in the hills. And he said, if I have to, I will die suffocating in my own blood. Now, do you know anybody who could say that in Ireland in relation to COVID? Micheál Martin should be on the television every 2 or 3 nights, telling the Irish people, not some unelected fella. I've looked at every country in the European Union, every democracy, and nowhere can I find the scientific guys giving the information. Look at our nearest neighbor. You mightn't think much of Boris or Matt Hancock or any of them, but they come to the podium flanked by the scientists, and they say this is what we're going to do. Now, scientists have, in fact, given them wrong information, but forget all that. The point is the politicians are in control. Where is Stephen Donnelly? I mean, I'm utterly convinced Stephen Donnelly wears a mask in Dáil Éireann so he won't be recognised. How can you have an anonymous minister for health when the country is facing a pandemic? You would have thought of all the jobs for a minister of health, a pandemic was the time you'd expect him.
Yes. Yeah.
He's nowhere. And Martin is nowhere. I don't want Houlihan telling me what to do. Who the hell is Houlihan? He's just a doctor. Would I go to my doctor and ask him how to fix the problem in my motor car? Would I go to my doctor and ask him, how do I handle my taxes this year? Would I go to my doctor and ask him who I should vote for? No. The last person, in fact, you go to ask about anything other than medical is his doctor. So Houlihan is deciding. Only this week, some fella called Tomas Ryan, professor of some horse manure stuff in Trinity College Dublin, comes on and says, you know, if these lobby groups stopped, the whole thing would be fixed. Lobby groups. I tell you who lobby groups are. Lobby groups are people who don't have jobs. Lobby groups are businesses that are closed. That's what lobby groups are, who are saying, please, can I have my job? Can I have my business? That's a lobby group. And this fellow, Professor, Ryan, dismisses us as just lobby groups. Like, I'm fine. I'm 79. Doesn't matter if I die at 80 or 85. It doesn't matter anyway. Just miss a few golf games. But, like, it doesn't actually matter. But what about my children and my grandchildren?
Yeah.
What about children who did no leaving certs and got rubbish remarks? Marks. They didn't get marks based on what they achieved. They got marks based on the computer.
So, George, you've heard people talk about authoritarianism and fascism in kind of relation to this, what's going on. And I wonder, do you think that's a bit much? Or like maybe this is just a bit of a cock-up where Micheál Martin maybe just is scared of, I don't know, doing the wrong thing and he would rather leave it to the experts like we're talking about? Or do you think there's something going on here with regard to control and power and freedom of people and their movements and I don't know, I'm stopping myself. Is it outrageous to say that there's an active effort to suppress religious association, or is this just another victim of and so on. Not just the religion thing, but that's a
All
huge
right.
thing that's
Once
increasing.
upon a
So,
time, in fact, if you described yourself as an expert, right, people actually dismissed you because experts always were considered too smart for their own good, right? But let's forget that for just a moment. What we see at the moment, I'm driving, and this has happened to me on 3 separate occasions. I'm driving, I'm taxed, I'm insured, I'm wearing my seatbelt, and I'm sober. So the policeman has no reason to stop me. But he stops me, and he stops everybody else, but he stops me. And he says, "Where are you going?" I'm going home. Well, where'd you start from? Now, seriously said, we should bring the army in, right? So, a bunch of kids drinking pints of stout in Black Rock. The army should arrive in and take them away. Now, last time this happened, the Black and Tans roamed the land in Crossley trucks, okay? We can't go to mass. We can't go to church. We can't pray to God. And there's a lot of people in Ireland pray to God, despite what you might think. We can't pray to God and say, "Dear God, save us from this pandemic." We can't do that. We're not allowed to do that. It's never happened. Now let's assume, and it's going to happen, roughly, probably 2025 is the next election, but it could happen before that. Next election, based on the current figures, Sinn Féin are in power. Taoiseach Mary Lou MacDonald and Minister for Justice Pearse Doherty say, well, we're putting the cops on the street because we think the people of Foxrock are going to revolt. All right? And everybody says, no, shame, you can't do that. Now, hold a while, there's precedent here for putting cops on the street and stopping people's movement, right? And I'm not referring specifically to Sinn Féin, but they're going to be the next government. So therefore, what we have created, and now I'm going to get a ton of stick, so maybe you might want to edit this out. Right?
No, keep going. There's no editing, George. There's no going back here. But go on.
Hitler was elected without ever getting more than 30% of the vote. So 70% of Germans did not want him as their chancellor. 70% of Germans did not subscribe to National Socialist ideology, right? The next government will probably have 35% of the vote, roughly speaking. That's what the next government will do.
The leading party, anyway. Maybe,
what we are creating now is we are creating things that have never happened in our history, have never happened to us as a democracy, where the police roam the street to stop law-abiding citizens for no reason, where association, and always one of the great things was freedom of association. You cannot associate in the street anymore because we may bring the army in if you misbehave, where you cannot worship. Is that the country you want to live in? I don't think it is. It doesn't have to be a pandemic the next time. It can be any excuse. This is a monumental challenge for democracy. Absolutely monumental. It's all you have to do now. Next time around, that you want to break democracy and civil liberties and free speech, is to cook up some other kind of pandemic. It doesn't have to be necessarily sickness. It can be something else. That's all you have
So
to
do you really, do you think that this could be used as a sort of a precedent, and it will be, like, do you think this is inevitable, or does this is something that needs to be mindful?
I have no doubt. If you can have an unelected civil servant, and that's what Tony Holohan is, an unelected civil servant, he can, and he bounced the government previously. He bounced the government into lockdown. And finally, they appear to have got some courage. And they finally told him, take a hike. All right? Like Holohan said, he said, the car parks are full. The citizens and paraphrasing, but the inference was the citizens aren't doing their duty. The car parks are full, which is exactly what he said. Are the car parks full? They are in my eye. I spoke to the chief executive of Dublin City Council, who told me the car parks in Dublin City are empty. Some of them, in fact, are simply just closed because there's nobody. So if he can get away with that, sure, he can get away with anything. We know that during the swine flu epidemic, he recommended, because it's in the High Court, so it's in the High Court, he recommended that children be given the swine flu vaccine, that it was safe. The Irish Medicines Board told him it wasn't safe. And now he went on News Talk and he went on RTE and he said, it is safe. Parents said, let's get our child vaccinated. Those children will never have a normal life again. They're not adults. They will never have a normal life again. And did he say that? Well, senior counsel said it in the case in the High Court. There are 80 cases before the High Court. Before that, over 200 women, 18 of whom have died to date, had their smear tests incorrectly assessed, and they were never told. Who was chief medical officer at that time? Tony Hula. At that time, the TD for Sinn Féin, Cullinan, and the leader of the Labour Party, although he may not have been at that time, called for his resignation. So, why is nobody asking the question? I mean, the essence of democracy is debate.
So, George, ideally, yeah, go on.
Well, what makes us different from Russia? Is we can hold a different opinion. Yes. I don't actually expect after this some fella to come around the corner with a poisoned umbrella and stick it in my butt. I don't actually expect that.
No.
And that's what makes us this country. That's what gives us freedom of speech.
So, George, Say it again. We don't have it. So, ideally, this conversation could be had between two people who disagree, right? And we can maybe try and come to a shared understanding. And what seems to be happening is that there's a conversation in, let's say, in the mainstream, and then there's another conversation outside of that. And I think that's a big challenge and a big limitation to this idea of the public square. So how do you see that challenge being risen to? And I'll give you an example. Let me give you a quote here, and it's a quote of you, and it was from an article. You mentioned John Waters earlier, and I have an article here that he wrote about you in 2014, and you wanted to be sorry, hold on a second. Why do we in radio think that 10 years from now people are going to be consuming radio the same way as they are now? So, and then this is another quote you said, so I am going to deliver between now and the day I go what I believe is the radio of the next generation. So you seem to be actually onto a changing of the ways of doing things, and I'm just wondering, what kind of vision did you have, and what kind of vision do you have now about what might be possible and what might be necessary to kind of come to grips with all of this stuff?
Well, you see, I don't know. I wish I did. But we know voices have been stilled. One of the greatest current affairs journalists RTE ever had got sacked because he went to a golf match. We look at Martin Feely, director of the Midlands General Hospital Group, dared to write on the Irish Times that maybe this wasn't as dangerous as it was made out. Following day, sacked. Now, it was dressed up as he resigned, but he was sacked. The only difference between him and General Rommel was they didn't actually hand him a gun and tell him blow his brains out. So the thing is, every opinion that is different is silenced. Every opinion. So, if it's wrong to go to a golf match and you apologize, is that okay? Well, we've just seen some of the biggest broadcasters in RTE break all the regulations and apologize. So it's okay. It's okay. No sanction. They don't lose a day's work. They don't lose a day's screen or radio time because they apologized. So whose apology is good enough and whose apology isn't? The apologies that aren't good enough are the people they want to silence. So at the moment, there is no contrary view. Now, contrary view could be wrong. This is the whole point. I'm not right. Yes. I'm not even saying
I get you. No, I get you.
Everything I could have said to you in this conversation could have been horse manure. But I am entitled to say it. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you, I'm 7 years of age. It's 1948. And my father takes me to London to see our cousins. And we don't have any clothes in the suitcase. We just have rashers and sausages and sweets because there's rationing in London, right? And so we bring this for our cousins. And then he brings me on the Sunday morning to Hyde Park Corner. And this 7-year-old who adores his father is holding his father's hand. There's all these guys up on soapboxes like shoot the Pope and let's have communism and all sorts of stuff, right? And my father says to me, he said, look here, son, he said, all these people can say the worst things possible, but they're allowed to say them. And he said, that is what free speech meant. And if he had said to me at 7, if he had said to me then, you know, the Jews were the Christ killers and you should burn down the nearest synagogue, I would have been a lifetime anti-Semite. But he didn't. He told me about free speech. So, like, I believe in free speech with an unbelievable passion. I have a greater passion for free speech than I have for rugby union.
Yes, and that's saying something, George. Well, look, I want to do 2 things. I've one final question for you. But before that, if I may, I want to read you some comments on the YouTube because I had a quick glance at them and they were overwhelmingly fondly kind of referring to you. So just if you might have something to say. But a couple of things, you know, just that you might like to hear. Hi, George. This is from Chelsea Joyce. Hi, George. I missed the right hook and Michael Graham. Hiya, James and George, the truth teller. That's from Fiona Murphy. Fionnuala Murphy, sorry. And then she said, I heard a great interview over on the Irish Inquiry this afternoon. Absolutely brilliant from George. He's quite right about the coaching for kids. I was hopeless at maths and poorly at some other subjects, but great at crafts and sewing and art, but was poo-pooed by my folks, etc. So just did office work. She was a great organiser, God bless her. Let me just find one more thing and then let's round off with this. George. Jeez, there's some stuff here that I can't...
You can't say
okay. George, let me give you one good one again. You have a duty to get back to tell the masses. So maybe you can be convinced. But anyway, let me just ask you
about coming back. Okay?
Yes.
Because every so often when I do something like this, I because I'm frail and I have weakness, you know, I start thinking, you know, maybe I should do this, you know. But the thing really is, I think there is a program for old age pensioners. In other words, that someone like me, could be anybody, but someone like me doesn't talk to 40-year-olds or 30-year-olds or 20-year-olds. There are more old people in Ireland now, obviously we know this, than ever before. And there's going to be more old people every year that goes by. So there is no radio program or television, but particularly radio, that aims at that demographic. So like, what are the tax problems for that age group? Or how do you survive on a low pension? Or, you know, how do I give my house to my kids? Or I don't know. There is a case for that kind of program, I think, you know.
So George, maybe you can do that. Let me just say that maybe you could get in touch with Mary-Louise O'Donnell. She's quite vocal on how we can serve the elderly in our society a bit better. And she's really in tune to that plight, maybe. And I don't know if that means anything, and if you could collaborate on that. But anyway, let me just read you a quote again from this article about you. and ask you a question, and we'll leave it at that, if that's okay. And I very much appreciate you giving me all this time this evening. But you said, like, I believe that somebody somewhere has set me a challenge in my life. They've given me all these skills, and I have to make the best of these skills that they've given to me, or otherwise I'm like the prodigal son. You know? So, George, I'm wondering, do you think you have risen to the challenge in a way that has been satisfactory overall?
Yeah, well, what I say to people always when I went for an interview in the past, or I met a new chief executive at Newstalk or producer at RTE, I used to say to them, in order to understand me, you would have had to have met my mother, right? So the first thing is, my mother could talk for Ireland, like she could just talk. So I got that. And where I went wrong in my life was I had these skills. I had the ability to speak. I'm not trying to be big-headed here, but it's a fact that I loved speech. I mean, I adored speech. Like, I was a debater. I read all Churchill's speeches. I could recite them verbatim, or Robert Emmet's speech from the dock, you know, all that sort of stuff. De Valera's response to Winston Churchill, all that sort of stuff. And but I was doing the wrong job. Like, I was in business. I should never have been in business, you know? And then suddenly I get this break. Now, I do a lot of stuff with young people. Like, I work with transition year, for instance, in my old school in Cork, Press Cork. And the key point I keep saying to them is, everybody is lucky. The problem is, there's a ton of people out there who wouldn't recognize luck if it slapped them in the face. So therefore, what you have to do is you have to think that today could be my lucky day, so I better do my best. So even though I was making a mess of my life for 25 years or more, I did my best every day. So when I got this lucky break in South Africa in the World Cup, and RG asked me to do 2 minutes with Fred Cogley by the pool in Johannesburg, I gave it my very best. Now, I didn't realize I might get a job at 25 quid out of it, but I gave it my best. I want to say is, you've got to give it your best. So every time I came off the radio or television or whatever, I said, was that my very best? Now, I never watched myself or listened to myself, but I always said, was that my very best? Because if it isn't my very best, I'm cheating myself. So I think that's the thing that made me survive. I mean, that, because I think I would have ended it in Dún Laoghaire. I don't know why I didn't dive in, you know, but like, I'm so glad I didn't, because it was all this stuff waiting for me, all this fabulous stuff, and I adored it. I mean, like, if people say, it's this great phrase, you know, that if you love your work, you never work, or words to that effect. Well, I never worked. Like, for 20 years, I never worked. I just adored it. I mean, I adored it. And I think because I started late, if I'd started earlier, like, I would have been wanted to be correct, because I wouldn't want to lose the job. But if somebody gives you a job at 55, you don't think you'll have it for a year. So you think, sure, if I lose it, well, so what? So that gave me a lot of confidence and freedom that I otherwise might not have had. Listen, you haven't got a word in edgeways. I think the next time we do this, I'll have to interview you.
Well, mate, I have nothing to say, George. I'm a rookie, and this is why I
Pretty
talk
good
to people
rookie.
like
I
you.
loved it.
No, I think this is wonderful, and I really appreciate this. I won't actually see you, George, for a while, because I'm in America, and with all the traveling and everything, I probably won't be home for a while, but maybe we can have a cup of tea or something. You can put on the kettle. I'll give you a ring, you know, and you answered the phone very quickly the other day, so I'll ring you again, and
I
we'll do
answer the
this.
phone, and I don't drink tea. So
Okay,
as long as I can drink black coffee, I'm
okay.
ready to go.
Good stuff. Well, George, thanks a million. I'm gonna stop
Thank
the
you.
recording, and
You.
we'll we won't say anything for a minute because it takes a few seconds. But anyway, I would just ask if anyone is watching and enjoyed George's sentiments, please do us a favour and share this video. He clearly is full of life and full of energy, and his message, I think, is worth, whether it's worth signing up, and in agreement, it's definitely worth hearing. So why don't you spread that with the world? Thanks a million. Slán Tamil. See you next week at 7 p.m. Irish time, 2 p.m. Eastern time.